So, welcome everyone. I am so delighted that you have joined us today for our webinar, A Conversation with the Authors, New Tricks for Old Bureaucracies. My name is Dr. Hillary Nixon, and I am Deputy Executive Director at the Manhattan Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI's mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. We accomplish this through surface transportation research, technology transfer, education, and workforce development. MTI currently leads 2 competitively selected multi-university consortia. In today's webinar, we will hear from the authors of New Tricks for Old Bureaucracies, a book supported by the Manhattan Transportation Institute about their work inside the Office of Extraordinary Innovation at the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority. I am delighted to introduce our speakers, Joshua Schank, Emma Huang, and Marla Westervelt Berg. Joshua Schank is an MTI research associate and a partner with InfraStrategies, a consulting firm that works with transportation in organizations around the world on strategy, innovation, and policy. He is also the executive director of the ACES Mobility Coalition and a senior fellow with the UCLA Institute for Transportation Studies. He served as LA Metro's first ever Chief Innovation Officer, and prior to that, as president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation. Emma Huang is a principal consultant with InfraStrategies, where she helps transit agencies navigate critical challenges, from foundational strategy to implementing innovative service models and policies. She has led the development of major strategic plans for agencies such as Dallas Area Rapid Transit, CAP Metro, and San Mateo County Transit District. She also served as a manager in LA Metro's Office of Extraordinary Innovation. And Marla Westervelt Berg is a principal at CityFi, where she helps governments and private sector companies navigate the rules, politics, and partnerships that shape innovation in civic space. Marla was also a founding member and head of research at LA Metro's Office of Extraordinary Innovation. Welcome to all of you. I am so excited. Let's launch right in with a short presentation, and then we'll dive into some questions and discussions.
Great. Thank you so much, Hillary. Great to be here. And I want to start just by giving a little bit of background. As Hillary mentioned, we were funded in part by the Manhattan Transportation Institute, and we're very appreciative that both Karen and Hillary played a role in helping us get this off the ground. The book is published by Business Expert Press, and we do ask that if you're going to purchase it, we recommend you purchase it on Amazon, either in hard copy or ebook. And please, if you like it, we'd appreciate your leaving a positive review on Amazon. So the next slide, just want to talk a little bit about the origin story of the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, because it's highly relevant to how we developed this book and the lessons learned in the book. The Office of Extraordinary Innovation was created in 2015 by then CEO Phil Washington. He was recruited to join LA Metro from the RTD in Denver, widely recognized as one of the top leaders in transportation in the country. He created this office because he saw a tremendous need to both work with the private sector more effectively and to create a strategic arm of the organization. So we really had 2 major roles in the organization. One, to liaison with the private sector to bring new ideas in, as well as potentially deliver projects in a more innovative way through alternative delivery. And second, to set the strategic direction of the organization through the strategic planning effort. And both of those impact how we learned about making change within public agencies. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we learned from that are in the book. I think you'll find the book is a very honest accounting of those lessons and what we learned, so that you don't have to go through some of the same challenges that we did, and can start your efforts to make change in public agencies on the right foot. So if we go to the next slide. There are 6 lessons in the book that the chapters are organized around these lessons, and I'm just going to go through the first 2 before turning it over to Marla. But the first one is one of my favorites because it's something that I really learned from parenting, which is pick your battles and win them. The reason you have to learn this as a parent, of course, is that if you try to tell your kids what to do and fight with them on everything, you'll be fighting with them all the time. And if you don't win, they're going to learn that they can push back and win. The same thing is true when you're working in a public agency. If you try to fight every battle, you're going to create a lot of enemies, and you're likely to also have a lot of losses. And when you lose, people don't necessarily trust that you're going to be able to put up the fight next time. So picking your battles and winning them is a critical component of success because you have to be selective and measure when you're looking at an issue to take on to see if it's really worth it. Second, you need to make friends to fix processes. I think one of the things we didn't necessarily realize when we first got to LA Metro is the extent to which collaboration and working with others and developing relationships was so critical to the success that we wanted to see. You can have all the great intellectual arguments in the world, you can make your case with all the data you want, but unless you have people who trust you and believe in you and can share in the vision you have of trying to make change, you're unlikely to make a lot of progress. And also, the key thing here is to fix processes. It's one thing to have an idea, but new technologies, new ideas, those are difficult to implement unless you can fix the process that is broken behind them. Technology doesn't fix processes, and new ideas don't fix processes. The only thing that fixes processes are people, and people have to work together to do that, and they have to like each other in order to be able to work together. So that's another critical lesson that we learned at Metro. And with that, I'll pass it to Marla.
Yes, the next lesson is recognize impenetrable fiefdoms. And this builds on the idea that you need to make friends and that not everyone's going to want to be your friend. There are power centers and organizations that are entrenched for a region and are not interested in the ideas that you might be coming to them with. And it's better to understand that early and figure out someone who actually wants to work on new ideas with you. And another key lesson was it's a marathon and a sprint. When we showed up, we knew we had to show our value as quickly as possible, and we were sprinting in every direction possible. And that was really critical because we needed to be able to build that trust and build that coalition. But in order to make real change, that takes time. And that is a marathon that takes place over multiple years as you make those friends and fix those processes. And with that, I will throw it to Emma for the last 2 lessons.
So lesson 5 of both naivete and experience are required. This lesson is helpful if you are building a team or even just reflecting on what values and skills you might need to harness. So you have to be naive enough to think that the solutions you are advancing are possible. Otherwise, it can be very easy to fall prey to all of the reasons why something cannot happen. And in this line of work, you have to get used to hearing something like, we don't have budget, we've never done that before, the board will never approve it, even that's illegal, and yet still find a way forward. And so if you practice some naivety, that means that you're not encumbered by knowing all of the rules. You aren't yet socialized into the norms or the power structures or constraints of the institution that you're working from within, or maybe you just choose not to be. And so this shows up like asking questions, proposing paths forward, speaking in terms of trade-offs and not just risks, and also drawing on research and evidence for your proposed solution. Experience is required because having that deep organizational fluency can give you the knowledge for not breaking all of the rules, but by knowing just enough of them to know which ones can be bent. And so it also typically means that you have the experience of working with people throughout the agency and are connected to the right people who may have an open mind and be willing to help you. And it's really experienced veterans that know that power within a public agency is really built through the trust and collaboration that both Marla and Joshua referenced. It's not by force. And it does take time to build that through talking to people, asking what they think, and then coming back to them to close the loop. And then the last lesson is beware your expiration date. And so this is a lesson that's very well documented in public policy literature, and it's also known as a policy window. And so just as a policy window is open when there is alignment across problems, across politics, across people and proposals, it also closes. And so we talk in the book about how much of our work was not possible without having Phil Washington as our champion, among others. And it's really only in hindsight when we saw how OEI functioned as an extension of the CEO's office and Phil, and our influence came from his authority. And so the lesson here is trying to recognize the moment you're in and what to prioritize when it's open. And so maybe that's easier said than done, but by looking at some of the signs that we reference in the book may help you. And those are the 6 lessons.
Great, thank you. Well, I think now let's turn into an open discussion, because I think that's what people are really excited about. I want to remind everyone who's joining us, part of our audience, you are welcome to submit questions for our speakers either through the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. But I want to start with a couple of questions, as we did have some pre-submitted questions as well. But let me start, and I think, Joshua, I'm going to direct this to you first. And you talked a bit about the origin story of the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, and you guys covered your lessons learned, but what really motivated you and your team to write new tricks for Old Bureaucracies? And maybe expand on that and tell us a little bit about who did you have in mind as the reader of this book, besides me?
Yeah, it's funny. The 3 of us actually sat down and talked about this at a TRB meeting some years back. And I think what inspired us to think about it was we were going through this experience collectively of trying to make change, and we're like, I don't think people would really believe what's going on here and what's actually happening. And to be something unique that we can relate to others that could be helpful. Because I think particularly if you've never worked in a public agency, and the 3 of us all had kind of limited experience working in public agencies when we started at the Office of Extraordinary Innovation, it can be kind of overwhelming and hard to understand why it's so difficult to make change. And we were going through that and thinking this might be useful for other people who care about trying to make change in public agencies, because that's why we got into this, right? And that's why I think a lot of people get involved with Mineta, get involved in transportation and urban planning, because they care about people and they want to make real changes that can improve people's lives. And here we were given so many opportunities, given the resources, given the power, given so many things that would enable us to make that change, and still we found tremendous resistance, and we ran up against so many obstacles. So we thought this might be useful to recount for others who are in our field and might want to try to make change, so that they can learn those lessons before they get started.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's super insightful, and I'm sure there are many readers who will take a great deal away from this book. Maybe turn so. And I don't know, maybe Marla, I'm going to direct this question to you. I know when I'm sitting in conversations, I'm attending conferences, I'm hearing public agency professionals talk, they're always talking about innovation. We want to innovate. But when someone says, all right, we want to innovate, what usually happens next, particularly within a large agency? Your experience at LA Metro, for example.
Yeah. So when we showed up at LA Metro, we thought that everyone was going to be jazzed. We were going to come in with all these new ideas And everyone would say, that's awesome. I'm so excited the CEO's on board. Let's get to work. And, sometimes that happened in an initial conversation. You're pitching an idea to someone, and they show some enthusiasm. But either in that initial conversation or as time goes on, they're going to start telling you all the reasons you can't do something. Joe thought about that idea in 1982, didn't take, so we can't try it again. I have so much work. I am so busy. Emma's point of it's illegal when it probably isn't. There's so many reasons not to do something. And, that's coming from a place of self-preservation often. Folks have a job to do, and innovation means doing something outside of the scope of, what their job description is. And, in the past, that may have been problematic for their leadership, or they might just not get credit for it. And so that was a hard lesson for us to learn because it didn't make sense to us until we really started thinking about it. But as we grew in our time at Metro, we got much better at changing that conversation of saying, okay, how could we do this? And creating space for more imagination to work with the folks that had that experience in the agency to figure out how to push those ideas forward.
Yeah, that's great. I want to turn now because there was a question submitted during the registration, and I'm thinking that based on this question, you guys might have a little bit of a fan club that's following you around because the registrant mentioned or asked the question about in previous talks about this book. You guys have talked a lot and identified some of the silos that you've worked within, probably many silos that you have worked within. And I think what they're really interested in knowing is like, okay, what do you have as advice to bust down those silos, to break them down, to allow complicated bureaucracies and organizations to work more effectively across these many different silos or offices and entities within? I'm not sure who wants to take that. Joshua?
Well, I think Emma would be great at that because she and I have worked with a lot of other agencies since leaving Metro, and we come across some of the same problems.
Right.
Yeah, I think silo busting really entails just giving yourself permission as if you're within an agency to do it. Agencies often have very kind of existing communication systems or protocols. But what I found from my time at Metro is a lot of people are receptive to having a conversation with you. And it's just a matter of like reaching out and having that conversation. And at the end of the day, people want to be involved. It's typically an issue of they either just didn't know about it or they don't have capacity. But we had some demonstrated success with the strategic planning effort that we did at LA Metro, where we were very deliberate about engaging all of the departments, even ones that you wouldn't think would have an obvious role with strategic planning. So that means engaging frontline mechanics, that means engaging finance. So actively making that a value in your project and building that time into your project schedule, that you are going to take some time and have conversations with folks that are still stakeholders and at least showing the willingness to do that. And I think also when approaching really anything, having kind of a lens that you can't just do this on your own in your department. Like that's just not going to go well. And we've heard, I think, time and time again, a lot of kind of horror stories about things that programs or pilots that are about to be launched and critical stakeholders don't know about it. And so I think just building that into your practice is probably the best approach.
Great. Thanks for that, both of you. There was a question that was just submitted from Jonathan, and this is super interested because we have to start somewhere. And your book's titled New Tricks for Old Bureaucracies. So let's get started at the beginning here. So Jonathan asks, what was the first trick you got people to agree to? What was the turning point? And then what was the turning point that made that implementation stick?
Yeah, I think I can start with the story of our first success, which was the Uber Expo partnership. That partnership at the time, this is right after the Expo line extension had opened to Santa Monica. And this was at a time when Uber was really taking over cities. We're talking about 2016. So they were just flooding city streets with lots of cars and low prices from venture capital money. And there was a fear, particularly in the public transit industry, like, hey, what is going on here? These folks are taking our customers. They're creating more congestion. They're working against us. And it was at that moment that we were trying to figure out, how do we work with Uber? How do we partner with them to advance common goals? And they submitted an unsolicited proposal that wound up being the Uber Expo partnership, which was to essentially use what they then called Uber Pool, which was a shared ride service, to bring people to and from the new Expo line stations under a simple promotion that would last just a couple of weeks after the opening. And you would think this might be an easy little thing to do, no big deal, we just do a quick partnership. You would be wrong. There was a tremendous resistance within the agency to this kind of partnership, for reasons we can all understand, right? I mean, this was one of the biggest line openings in the history of the agency, to connecting Santa Monica to downtown, restoring what had been an old streetcar line. Like that, they didn't want to have distract from that with some random Uber thing, right? And also, you're working with Uber, like the enemy, the folks who are trying to poison public transit. Why would you do that? And so we really faced resistance from every part of the agency. But as we referenced earlier, we did have Phil Washington as our backup. And when we brought to him a list of concerns, most of them from the legal department, frankly, about why this would be a terrible idea for us to move forward with the partnership, he simply went through them and said, okay, I understand the risk. I'm signing off on all of these. Let's go. We're doing it. And that's a great example of, first of all, picking your battle and winning it, but also that success. What that did is it showed people that we weren't going to back down in the face of resistance, that we were going to push forward with new ideas when we thought they were worth testing, and that we were going to stick around. So that was a key moment in our existence, because it gave us real credibility going forward.
I love that. And actually it segues really nicely, I think, into another question that was submitted from Michael. And you mentioned you got some resistance. And that I can imagine being in a large bureaucracy or even a small bureaucracy, there's going to be those few people who are really, really vocal. They're difficult to work with. They're,
No.
as Michael talks about, they're undermining, they're just making your life really, really difficult to do your job. So he asks, how do you deal effectively with what might be just a few really, really loud, difficult voices?
Well, Marla, you want to take that one?
Fantastic question. There are many strategies, and I think all three of us used different ones at different times, as did other folks across OEI. So I'll start with, Emma and I were more junior employees in OEI. And that limited our toolkit, but also gave us a tool that someone like Joshua couldn't use, which meant we were able to go spend an inordinate amount of time with the folks who were opposing our idea. Maybe it was, the head of ADA who says, your whole project is illegal and here's why. And really working with him to understand his perspectives, working with legal, working with the FTA, whomever, to bring him along. It's a very, very time-consuming approach, but it can be really effective. Other folks would use a charm offensive and flattery. We would sometimes use the tool of doing our homework and knowing more than anyone else in the room, which is a tough one to do because you have to make sure that you're not coming off as the smartest person in the room or arrogant, but you also have to be able to back that up. And so that's just a handful of the tools that we use. But there's also the truth that we highlighted, which is some people are not going to come along with you on that ride, and some people are going to be blockers no matter what you do. And, again, for all of us, that was a hard thing to accept. But when we did, we got much more effective.
That's great. Emma, I saw you come off mute briefly. Were you going to add in something?
I was just going to say that, it kind of depends on who. And so to Marla's point, if that person controls a fiefdom, then you may not win that battle. And so perhaps don't invest a lot of resources into it. But if that person has staff that you either have good relationships with or you can cultivate good relationships with, that can be an angle. They respond better to authority, and it's helpful if you bring your chief innovation officer or deputy chief innovation officer just to sit in a meeting with you and to just nod and say like, yeah, that's what they said, right? Mm-hmm. So there's different ways, and it just really comes down to trying to understand what's driving that opposition. But yeah, to Marla and Joshua's points, like at the end of the day, sometimes no matter how much data or how much relationship building you have, it really just comes down to the personal, and you might just have to walk away.
Oh, that's great. Thank you both. So I want to turn to a question that came in earlier, and we know that government agencies, small, medium, large, they're understaffed. They have resource constraints. They're working just to keep the lights on and things, at an operational level. And they don't necessarily have, or at least maybe don't think they have the capacity for innovation. What would be the advice that you would give them? What ideas that you have that could help these agencies who might not think they have the capacity? Maybe they really do.
Yeah, I think, that's, as Marla mentioned, that's one of the excuses I think we heard the most, right? Is like, I can't take this on. I just don't have the capacity. And people aren't lying about that. They're right. They often don't have the capacity. But the question is, why don't they have the capacity? What are they busy doing? And is it accomplishing the mission that they intend to achieve? So that's why I think Phil Washington gave strategic planning to OEI, is that strategic planning is an exercise in which you think about what are the goals that we're trying to achieve. And if those are the goals, then what are the specific things that we're going to do to achieve them? And then you throw out everything else that you were doing that wasn't working towards achieving those goals. That's the part of it that people have the hardest time with, but that's how you free up capacity constraints. So when we did this at LA Metro and created Vision 2028, we created a very ambitious picture of what we wanted to achieve as far as getting people to use more multimodal transportation options. And in order to do that, we had to bring along all these different departments, and every one of them would say, well, how do you expect us to accomplish this in this period of time? We don't have the resources to do it. And then we would have to come back and work with them and say, okay, well, what are you currently doing? And do those things achieve this goal? And can we potentially free up some resources through that process? And frankly, that's what Emma and I do now. We work with transit agencies around the country on that same concept, because it's so valuable and so critical. If you are clear about what you're trying to achieve, if you're clear about what problem you're trying to solve, you're far more likely to find the resources to solve it. Often the lack of resources is just due to a muddled sense of what it is you're trying to achieve in the first place.
No, thank you on that. Which actually allows me to segue a little bit. A lot of times, particularly with limited resources, people will say, well, we'll pilot something. We'll do a pilot project, and that'll get us the first step along the way. But then they often have trouble making that transition from pilot to real scaled change. Why is that so hard? Is that the right approach? What can we do to kind of make that real scaled change happen?
Yeah, and I think Emma and Marla both played a role in leading pilots that did lead to permanent programs. So maybe, Marla, do you want to start?
Yeah. I think it partially depends on how you're setting up a pilot, right? There is like the Uber Expo pilot that Joshua already highlighted. That was not designed in a way to stand the test of time. That was designed to get done in 6 weeks on the blood, sweat, and tears of some of our colleagues. And so necessarily that was never going to grow. And I think that can be true in a variety of pilots when the goal is speed. Um, because after that, then you have to figure out, okay, what are all of the real barriers that we have to overcome to make this full scale? And, where do I find the resources financially, personnel, etc.? I think the alternative approach is taking more time to develop that pilot with the intent of scaling it over time. And in fact, that was often some of the feedback I would get internally when Ev and I were putting together a mobility on demand pilot, which is, well, if we do this for 5 minutes, we'll do it for forever. So we have to make sure that it's done perfectly. And so I think we had to navigate and balance the trade-offs of, okay, let's be thoughtful, but we also do want to get this out on the road because you have to be iterative and you have to test things, learn from it, and try again, which creates an inherent tension. And I'll throw it to Emma to build on that.
Yeah, I would say that it's a lot of, private sector companies or tech companies, they do their work through iteration, and that can be hard for a public agency because we have an obligation. We have many obligations, but one is like to communicate so much to our stakeholders ahead of time. And so it makes planning things very difficult. And so needing to set that expectation to your stakeholders about how this pilot is going to be super flexible and super iterative, and that those are two values that you're holding from the beginning. Flexibility is absolutely necessary when, especially if it comes to a new service, because you don't know what you don't know. And so you need to be able to make these changes so that it has a chance of being successful. The second thing I think that's really critical to a pilot is agreeing up front that this, if it's a new service, it's going to be more than 6 months, because frankly, it takes a lot of time to get people used to a new service. And I think a lot of resistance to some of these new services is by looking at like a very short amount of time and saying, oh, well, you really didn't do that much in these 6 months. When it's a pilot that's only at 3 stations, and for 6 months, you really can't expect it to have the amount of scale that you would expect. And so I think being really clear up front of those, how you're going to have those values and exercise those values is important, but then also evaluating it and having that data readily available. And that may seem like an obvious thing, especially, we're here at MTI, which we love research, but not everyone prioritizes that, I think, and recognizes how valuable it can be.
That was a great answer, and it actually partners beautifully with one of the submitted questions from Deborah. And I know several of you, Joshua, you've been involved with UCLA and at MTI with San Jose State, so you have relationships with universities. So for academics, for faculty, whether they're in urban planning or, maybe even in transportation engineering and other disciplines as well, but what is the role of us as academics, as researchers, as educators, and also our students? In fact, I've seen through the chat, folks introduce themselves. We've got a number of students or future students in the audience. What can we do? What is our role to help cities make change?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a critical role for research. And one of the things that OEI was created to do was to be a liaison to the academic community, so that research could be translated into action. And Phil Washington recognized the critical role that research can play. Not every transit agency leader does, right? And so if I'm in the academic community and the research community, I'm trying to find those leaders that do appreciate that and do want to incorporate that into their thinking, and try to talk to them because they'll want to hear what you have to say. Marla, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the OEI advisory board that we set up and how we were able to get a lot of academic input into the organization.
Yeah. So prior to coming to LA Metro, Joshua and I worked at a transportation policy think tank. And so we were very entrenched in the world of research. And that was kind of the framework that I particularly took when evaluating any problem. And we knew that we wanted to be able to continue to get insights from folks from outside of the organization, from academia, from the private sector, from wherever. So we brought together an advisory board of folks that were primarily based in California, and the key academic institutions in the Los Angeles area. And we would have, I think, about quarterly meetings with these folks and really talk through our problems in a very honest and authentic way. We would come to them and say, hey, we are trying to do this partnership with this ride hail company, and they're not collaborating. What do we do? And I think it was really useful to be honest, which I think is something that, there's a lot of fear in public agencies to go in front of people and say, I don't know how to move this forward. But it was through that process of working with folks who were paid to spend their whole day thinking about big ideas to give us the feedback that allowed us to make some of the hardest decisions that we had to make. And I think that was one of the more valuable things that we did. But I'll also add from a research perspective that there are two things that I think that the academic community can do to even better work with public agencies. And I mean, these are things that folks know, which is, we have to get out research faster. The peer review cycle can get in the way of the ability for research to be applicable. I read reports and I see what's published, and it's on insights that we had a decade ago. And that's really hard to action because we've already kind of processed that in the public sector. And I think the other key thing is having the willingness to make clearer recommendations, which can be antithetical to an academic sometimes, but you really have to take a stance and say, okay, this is what we learned. So what? Here's what we do with it next. And I think that can be really, really helpful for those of us in the public sector who are trying to make hard decisions.
No, that's great insight. Thank you there. Emma, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I think what I have always encouraged graduate students to think about when wanting to enter the public sector, and I think it would be helpful for, I think academics do this too, is realizing how many public policy decisions are made and must be made with incomplete information, and getting comfortable with doing that. And so having students be comfortable making decisions with an incomplete data set and knowing, okay, what is an acceptable assumption I can make with my expertise that I'm comfortable with and stand by that. I joined OEI when I was in graduate school. I was in the MPP program, the Master of Public Policy program at UCLA Luskin. And I was going into my second year, and I was excited to start with OEI as a fellow. And I remember showing up, and I was assigned like a research question, and I was super excited to get started. And I was like, great, like show me the data. And no one had any information, and no one knew who had that information, if it existed, was it complete? And I didn't realize that, because in graduate school, I was very used to working with these really clean data sets, right? And I had to get creative, and part of my job was trying to find the person who might have the data, trying to understand, if they're willing to give it to me. We've talked a lot about these silos and fiefdoms, and with that sometimes comes access to data. And so some of those skills that are necessary to be successful in a public agency may not be like the obvious ones, right? It may be how do you figure out who has this information and if they're willing to give it to you? And it can seem like a really simple question, but it can really come down to whether you're successful or not.
Yeah, that was great. Great insight. I think that's advice I would have loved as a graduate student or even as an early faculty member. It's an interesting question that just came up from Cameron. And we're hearing a lot of conversation about AI, artificial intelligence in transportation. And I'm sure as we're thinking about emerging trends and where things are going, how do you think, or how has AI impacted your work in recent years, or how do you see it impacting the work that is happening in the transportation sector, agencies, or private?
Marla, do you want to start?
Yes. So I recently worked at an AI company that did subsurface utility mapping. And, you know, our role was to figure out how to improve the way that we figure out what's under the ground so we can accelerate transportation projects. I learned a lot about AI in that process. And, I think my key takeaways are you have to understand how AI actually works. AI is not creating information from nowhere. It has to be trained on real data. It can't just make up something, which means it's not magic. It's not going to be some magical solution to everything. What can happen is that we can develop technology focused on specific problems, and that can help make our jobs much easier from a construction perspective, from an operational perspective, from a communication perspective. And I think that the public sector has a great opportunity to figure out how to adopt AI and leverage those benefits. I also think that we're in a moment where it's really important to develop a clear framework and parameters and policies around how we use AI, because that will allow us to be able to get those benefits into the future. One of the things that we've talked about regarding technology, whether it's AI or anything else, automation, is we really want to make sure that the public sector isn't the only ones that aren't able to adopt it because of, legal restrictions or antiquated approaches. And so I think that having that as the guiding light of figuring out how can I align the public interest with the values of these tools and do that thoughtfully is something that I certainly encourage all public sector employees to focus on.
Great, thank you. Vanessa, our audience member, has got a really interesting question. And we've talked about, we want to cover the good, the bad, the ugly. And so she gets at, it's like, look, there are going to be these transformative efforts that lots of folks try, but really they're just not moving the needle. They're not successful. You hear agencies try it over and over again, but it's not making a difference. So what do you see in your experience as those most common transformative efforts that don't really move the needle, and where should agencies focus instead?
Yeah, I think that the problem is that we have a tendency to think about the transformative things that are going to be most visible and most prominent. And it's understandable, right? You new CEO, you come to a transit agency, you're going to try to pick something that transformative, that is really ambitious and that people can see and that really matters. But in some ways, I think that can be a mistake, because some of the most transformative things you can do can be really behind the scenes, and you're more likely to succeed and you're more likely to achieve a greater outcome. I think a great example of that I've seen, and Emma and I, we'll see when we work with every transit agency around the country, is almost every agency says our procurement system is not working effectively, right? Almost all of them. And yet, very few agencies devote the time and effort and resources that's necessary to really reform procurement. but it affects everything the agency does in a deep and meaningful way. One of the things that we were able to do immediately at LA Metro was create this unsolicited proposal process. It was an idea that Phil Washington had implemented in Denver with some success. And the unsolicited proposal process was essentially a method of improving procurement by creating a dialogue between public and private sector about the ideas before you get to the RFP process, so that you're more likely to put out an RFP that's successful in achieving what both sides want to achieve. And that change, that reform alone, spurred so many of our innovations, spurred ideas for project delivery and changes at LA Metro that are still in place now. So I think it's trying to find out where can you be transformative without thinking about, oh, I have to make a big splash, and instead thinking about what's really going to be a dramatic change for the agency, and one, like I said in the first lesson, that I can win, a battle that's actually achievable for me, because that's how you'll make real lasting change.
No, that's interesting. And you brought up in your question, or in your response, you talked about the incredible role that Phil Washington had. He brought it from Denver. He came to LA Metro. He set up OEI. But, he left, leadership changes, leadership transitions. So Joe asks, so what happened with OEI after Phil Washington left? Was it continued? And actually, maybe a second part to that question: do you have to have an OEI at the agency to be successful with innovation and transformation?
Yeah, Emma, maybe do you want to take that one and you talk a little bit about the recovery task force, because that was something that we worked on towards the end of our tenure.
Yeah, I mean, so we the OEI during COVID was kind of named as the steering committee for the recovery task force. And this was a task force that was basically comprised of individuals that were not at the executive level, but more at like the middle level of the agency. And we were tasked with helping to come up with actions that Metro was going to take to recover from COVID. It was because of the conditions of COVID and things were like drastically changing. We were trying to bring as much research into the process as possible to kind of evaluate conditions and stay ahead of things. But we are also trying to approach the committee a little bit differently than how typical committees are, because it was a more of a staff-driven committee. I guess a lot of the kind of typical ways that we operated were not used to. So there was a very kind of flat committee hierarchy. We were really trying to just brainstorm initially and just get ideas out. It was pretty atypical for a lot of the folks that were participating who weren't used to such an environment where you could throw out an idea and it's just an idea, nothing more. And so while Phil was there, we were able to put forth some pretty transformative issues. But as we were trying to advance those issues, and as Phil's tenure became public that he was leaving, it became clear that momentum that we had earlier to help advance some of those initiatives, that was kind of coming to a close, and we were getting a lot more resistance. And also, as a leader who's exiting the building, staff kind of, there may be a lull. And so I think what Joshua is going to comment on is that OEI exists in a different form now. And what happens as when new leaders come in and they situate and organize and figure out what's important to them, like there's a lull. And so you may see that some of your projects get paused, and there's just some time that it is taken to determine like what happens next. And so some folks may stick through that and decide that they're going to wait and see like how their projects pan out, and some folks may decide to leave.
Thanks for that.
Hillary, I'd just add to the second part of your question about does an agency need an OEI? No, I don't think an agency needs an OEI. An agency needs a leader that is willing to back people who are trying to make change and accept the failures that go along with that. That OEI was the form that took at LA Metro, but there are other ways of creating that environment. If you have a leader and leadership that is willing to say, I'll own the failures, you go out there and try new stuff, and I'll give you the resources and the time necessary to do it. You don't necessarily need a separate office to do that.
That's great. Thank you. Jack's got a question that he posed. And Marla, I think I might start with you on this one. Each one of you, Marla, Joshua, and Emma, came with different backgrounds. You were at different stages of your career when you came to OEI. So Jack asks, how did your time at OEI affecting change you and your thinking? And Marla, I pose it to you first.
Yeah, I think it fundamentally changed the way that I think about what my why is as a professional and how I navigate the professional landscape. I often bring up the strategic plan at LA Metro, maybe not by name, but when I talk about the importance of getting people where they need to go when they need to get there, that comes from our time at LA Metro. And so I think that's one component. I think it also changed the way that I evaluate how to solve problems and have a lot more empathy for the challenges that there are. For example, I remember we were working with a private sector company and we needed to get a document signed. And I had to be the bearer to tell this guy that we needed a wet signature. He's working at a tech startup. He thinks I'm crazy. He literally told me, you must be making that up. That's insane. Whilst I agreed with his, assessment, I wasn't making it up and I needed a wet signature. And that's what we had to do to move that forward. And, that's just like one example of all of the crazy barriers and challenges that public sector officials are facing every single day. And so, you might at a cocktail party hear people complaining like, why haven't they fixed this? Why aren't the trains on time? Why isn't something else working? And I'm often the annoying person to say, well, here are a variety of the things that they're dealing with. And here is, the reasons why that's hard to overcome, which makes me a bad time at a cocktail party, but I think makes me a much better steward of the public interest, whether I'm sitting in a private sector seat or a public sector seat.
Oh, that's great. I know we are coming to the end. It amazes me. An hour has just flown by. We are coming to the end of our hour. And so I want to make sure I wrap things up and transition us out. So I want to pose this first to Emma and maybe Marla, Joshua, if you have thoughts as well, please chime in. But you've written this book. You put a lot of effort and thought and consideration into it. People are reading it. But if there is one idea you want people to take away from the book, as well as this conversation and other conversations that you've been having, what is it?
I think the book is about how much enabling change and good public policy can come down to the personal. And so for one of the reasons for writing the book was coming from a public policy program that taught me the technical aspects of evaluating policy alternatives and less about the aspect of working within a large organization that ultimately is run by people. And so it's having those strong relationships with people across all levels and functions as really being critical to success. And it's those trusted relationships that allow for the candid conversations and the provision of information that may not have been communicated in a large group meeting. And it's also the difference from someone on the receiving end of your question or your proposed solution, trusting that you're communicating with good intent. And so I think if that can help lift the veil to our readers about how important that is, and it kind of gives some validation that you can and should work outside of the power structures and the norms of that organization to do that good work.
Great, thank you. Marla or Joshua, did you have any thoughts on that? What's your one big takeaway?
I loved what Emma said, so +1 to that. And I think the other big thing is that you just have to try. One of the things that we talked a lot about as we were writing this book, especially Emma and I, was, we were at a staff level that had less power, and we wanted to be able to write to people that were sitting in similar seats to ours, people who maybe didn't have a Phil Washington or Joshua Schank to empower them. And whilst those things and having a policy window really helps to make that meaningful change, there's a heck of a lot of change you can make without that. And I think that the tools that we highlight are useful for anyone at any level. But you just have to try, and you have to be willing to put in the challenging work that comes from the building relationships and understanding the human side of building policy.
And Joshua, any last thoughts? What's your big takeaway?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you know, I teach a class at UCLA, and I used to also teach a set of Eno fellows every year. And what those things have in common is people come from graduate school, and I'm someone who spent a lot of time in the academic community. I love the academic community, but they come ready to show you how the data shows and how the research shows how to do something, and to make the case for that. And what I teach in my class at UCLA is that really what the hard part is not making the case for your idea. The hard part is the execution of that idea. And my recommendation to people who are in graduate school at San Jose State or elsewhere who are thinking about these changes and wanting to make change in the public sector is focus on how you build relationships and how you communicate more than how you can extrapolate the data to show something that's new and useful. And I know that's a little contrary to how academic programs are often set up, but it's really critical. When we taught a class within OEI, we taught two things: how do you write a memo, and how do you give a presentation? Those are the things that actually make change. When you build relationships by communication, sometimes it's through having breakfast or having drinks, and sometimes it's through writing the memo and giving the presentation, but that's how you make change. And so if you're going to spend time in grad school, I always say that the most useful course I ever took when I was in grad school was the facilitation and negotiation class that I took. Like, those are the skills that will lead to success and to execution of some of these big ideas that you care about.
Thank you. What an absolute fabulous way to wrap this up. I've got a ton of questions that we didn't get to. So for those of you who post questions that we did not get to, I am so sorry, but I am willing to bet that this team is going to be having a few more of these conversations. So keep an eye out for presentations and future events from the team about their book. And thank you so much, Marla, Emma, and Joshua, for joining us, and to all of the participants in today's webinar. We just loved having you here. Some great questions. So for future events, please check out MTI's event page. We've got the link in the chat. We are also hosting a virtual fireside chat series that features influential women leaders in transportation. The next session is going to be held on May 19th. It will feature Compto President and CEO April Rye. I certainly hope to see many of you there. And for the rest of you, please enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you again so much for being with us for this conversation.